Good morning, good morning. Come on down, have a seat. We are now live online, so you're being recorded. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to October. Isn't it pretty outside? Whew, I love it. Let me open in some prayer and we will get started with today's session. Lord God, we thank you again for gathering us. We thank you for this church family with whom we can open your word and study and allow your Holy Spirit who inspired it to inspire us by it. I pray that we have availed ourselves of your word. I pray that this class today and as we continue our readings would be fruitful to you. Thank you again for preserving this word. Thank you for it being impactful in our lives. Thank you for your son, Jesus. In his name I pray. Amen. All right, so I don't see any new faces, I don't think, so thank you for coming back. This is a little confession time. The idea of studying the Torah for 2 quarters I thought was inspiring to me. Frankly, I was a little more dreading this second quarter here. The idea of plowing through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy probably for most of you is not as appealing as the idea of Genesis and Exodus. So we're in the same camp. As your teacher, I'm in the same camp. But obviously there is great value in understanding the foundational scriptures of all that are built upon it. And the first 5 books set the stage for the entirety of the gospel. They set the stage for the Messiah. And we might find this coming quarter as we're reading some passages that might seem tedious and seem particularly detailed on things that don't apply to our lives. Let me just ask you to push through those moments if you have those moments, and I think you're going to. Push through them. There's no promise that every daily reading is going to be invigorating, but there is promise that every daily reading is going to have value. And there is something in each of these words that has been preserved for us. And so just to charge, I'm speaking really to myself as much as I am to those who are hearing me. All right, so let's get into this. We're gonna after my little intro, we're gonna go back to and have an open mic and then a prepared lesson on finishing Exodus, because those who were here last quarter should have done that and should have enjoyed a couple days off. This week's readings, starting today through Saturday, is Leviticus 1 through 7. And if you don't have it, I've got a couple of spare copies behind where Tony Roden is sitting, paper copies of the reading schedule, a couple of composition books as well. If you don't have either of those and want one or both, please take them before you leave. The reading schedule is in the messenger each week, so you should have that as a fallback, and it's also available online if you're finding yourself without paper or messenger but have internet connection. All right, by way of quick introduction into what we're going to encounter the next 3. Yes, mic issues again?
People to let them know that.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Mark is going to be roaming around with the microphone, so as we're having dialogue in here, we're going to do our best to be sure that our online viewers are getting something out of this and not just hearing me drone on and on. What can we expect this quarter? By way of really quick introduction and overview of the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Leviticus focuses primarily on God's holiness and how man is to approach him. As I've told you, I'm a week ahead of you all for a variety of tactical reasons. So the first 7 chapters are heavy on the sacrifices. A lot of detail on that, and the folks like Tiffany and maybe some others are going to not be so thrilled with reading about all these animals that are slaughtered and whatnot. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of the establishment of the priestly order and what the priests are to do and how the people are interact with them and interact with their God. And again, it sort of sets this is a holy God we're in the presence of, and here's how man should interact with him. The book of Numbers, we often think of Numbers using the title as an unfair crutch and think it's just a book of census. There is some census in there. I promise you that the 36 chapters of Numbers is not all about who begat who and how many people are in so-and-so's tribe. There's a lot of that. But really kind of once you get past that, we get back to a narrative. We get back to the Israelites at the cusp of entering the promised land for the first time and how they made some choices that caused them to walk around 40 more years in the sand before they got back a second time with a new leader. So we get more of a narrative in the back 2/3, 3/4 maybe even of Numbers. And then the book of Deuteronomy is where Moses is essentially giving charge to the Israelite people. He knows that he is not going to be going with them into the promised land. God reveals that to him because of a moment of rash decision-making on his part. But he's basically charging his people, here's what lies ahead. And again, in case you forgot, Here's who God is. There is a God. Here's who he is. Here's what he's done for you. Let's not forget these things as you're about to enter into this new world, this new normal for you, with all these peoples that are in the land of Canaan that have all manner of gods and idol worship. Be true to who you are. Be true to who your God is, so on and so forth. So that's essentially really broad brush stroking of the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what we're going to be covering for this next quarter. Any questions on that before we plow into today's topics? All right. Any questions or comments on chapters 36 through 40 of Exodus? That's what should have been on your plate, and you should have eaten that plate full this week. Any observations, any questions, anything that spoke to you? Again, I have a prepared lesson, but I'm eager to have the mic be open and make Mark roam around the room, putting mics in front of people who raise their hand and have anything to say.
There's a lot of things in the Bible I'd like to see, for sure.
Okay. Hang on one second, David. I'm sure you have a great thing to say, and I want the people on. No, just stop. Would you just stop? Wait.
The cloud coming down over the tabernacle.
Yep.
And at night, the fiery, just trying to envision that.
Envision what that would look like.
It's very hard to understand that. But something I would love to be able to.
Yeah.
Just a cool experience.
No.
That everybody could see.
Great insight. Yeah. And recall, really, from the get-go, God made his presence visible. And when they're wandering, it was a pillar of cloud and fire. And then as he descends onto Mount Sinai, he comes in a thunderous cloud. And then as he comes onto the tabernacle, as David said, there's this cloud presence. And at certain times, it's kind of a fiery cloud. And you kind of wonder, one, how awe-inspiring that must have been to be in the presence of those things. And what would that actually have looked like?
I have a question.
Yes, Rena.
I cannot imagine how big the tabernacle was because of the cubit and all that. I have no idea. Was it large? Was it, I don't know.
Good question. So you're obviously reading from a translation that preserves the cubit. Mine, which is the Holman Christian Standard, does attempt to convert it into measurements that are more familiar to us. It was a significantly large structure, I can tell you that much. It wasn't massive, I don't think, but it was large enough to have a holy place, a Holy of Holies place, a courtyard on the outside, and spots for all the various things that God had directed be made and put in this tabernacle. But by way of dimensions, I don't have that handy, but it was an impressive place. But likewise, it was meant to be a temporary place. They weren't to set up permanent shop. Once they enter the promised land and generations, maybe even millennia afterwards, there's an actual temple and it's a permanent structure, and God wanted that at that moment for that time. But as for these people, permanency wouldn't be appropriate because they were not yet in their landing spot. And so they built, per God's direction, this tabernacle that allowed it to travel, allowed God to travel, so to speak, and still have his dwelling place. Emily, you had a question.
Well, yes, I'm glad you brought that up, and the one before about the cloud. In verse 38, it's the last verse that we read of chapter 40.
All right, chapter 40, verse 38.
The last verse, 38, it says, "For the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all of their journeys." Well, if it was that big, and they must not have journeyed very far during the day.
Well, it moved,
all of their
Emily.
journeys, and they were within sight of the tabernacle? I don't understand.
Well, again, the tabernacle is essentially a tent. It's a pack it up. When we're leaving, the tabernacle gets packed up and put on whatever it was to carry it to the next spot. So the tabernacle was essentially an elaborate tent-based temple.
So it wasn't all that big then.
Well, right. It was big enough to meet God's needs and allow the people.
I had a feeling it was, much bigger.
Right. Well, it was.
It can be pretty big, like the circus tents. Huge.
Yeah, right. Good point. Yeah, don't think backyard pup tent. Think the big top tent. Say that again, Cody.
They had a whole nation of people to transport
That's right. So it was big enough that the people were able to haul it off because there was 1 million some odd folks, 600,000 of which were men who could put some of it on their back and whatever. Good questions, comments. Any others?
Was 35 for this week, or was that last week?
You know, it was supposed to be for last week, but I'll entertain a question on chapter 35 if you have one.
Question, there's just something that stood out to me when they were getting the contributions in 35.
All right, well, hold on, because that's actually my lesson, so don't go there.
Never mind.
Time out. Thank you. Yes, John. Hang on one second. We're making Mark roam for sure.
Big crowd today.
Yeah, that's the goal. You know, our mission should be make Mark not sit. So
Just a real quick comment. When we were coming here this morning, we passed by the Lutheran church that's a couple blocks up there. And they had big banners out there saying that they were celebrating the Feast of the Tabernacle starting next Sunday. And I was just curious which Christian denominations celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacle.
you know, John, that my understanding, that used to be a Lutheran church, and now it's a Messianic church. So, and I've been very curious, you know, how that, but that's my understanding. So they're doing a lot more of what we're reading than the traditional Christian churches that we might gravitate towards. Yeah, but it was a Lutheran church, because I know you and I share a Lutheran background, and I knew that was the case, but it's now, I think, a different. Last one, Lee. I'm saying last because I do want to get to the lesson. You guys are great, and I hate shutting it down.
In
But
the Sinai desert in
Okay.
Israel, the Baptists have built a exact model of this.
of the tabernacle.
You go through, yes, it's very impressive.
Interesting.
It is big and very dark.
Okay, and so you've actually been to that.
Sandy and I have been through it, yes.
Wow. All right. So Rena, Emily, you want to pick Lee and Sandy's brain about. He was saying while they were missionaries over in the Middle East, there is an actual structure that's a replica of what the tabernacle would have looked like, and it's in place in the Sinai desert.
Very much so, for years.
Interesting.
Do you have a picture of it?
Well, probably Google does. Probably Google does. So look up replica tabernacle in Sinai desert, something like that. Good stuff. All right, let's go to Exodus 35. I shut Leslie down because I wanted to start there. Shut her down. Much of the last half, stay with me, much of the last half of the book of Exodus was God communicating to Moses, here's what I want the tabernacle to look like. Here are its dimensions, you know, spoken initially in cubits. Here are the support structures, here's the cloth, and here's what I want you to have inside of it, just, you know, detail after detail, and very impressive. And then once we got through that, there was some dialogue between Moses and the people, and then the very last, really kind of the readings that you had this past week were mostly the craftsmen putting direction to action and actually creating these various structures. They were told to assemble a variety of raw materials, and Leslie, you may not have wanted to go there, but I'm going to volunteer you to be our reader for Exodus 35, if you could read verses 4 through 9. This is what, well, hang on, before you go there. So again, the details were fine yarn and gold and silver and bronze and this and that and the other, and you know, what were the raw materials that were actually needed to create all the structures that God said? Leslie's going to read some of those things. So again, we're at chapter 35, verses 4 through 9. I've given her a longer assignment. Thank you for cooperating.
Moses said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, "This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. Take from among you a contribution to the Lord. Whoever is of a generous heart, let him bring the Lord's contribution: gold, silver and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, goat's hair, tanned rams' skins and goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastplate."
All right, pause right there. Actually, you're done. Thank you so much. So this is what God, or what Moses is calling the people to contribute, which begs a question. Weren't these folks just like slaves for 200 years before they started wandering in the sand? How is it that they have such things? Do y'all remember the answer to that question?
They went to the Egyptians before they left, and God turned the Egyptians' heart to be generous, and they asked for it.
Indeed. So let's go there. Go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 12. Rhonda, can I have you be a volunteer for that?
Sure.
Since you were quick to volunteer. Yeah, we'll get to 12 first, and I'll give you more specifics. Exodus chapter 12, specifically verses 35 and 36. So this is basically after Pharaoh says, out. My firstborn is dead, and the nation is wailing, and finally I'm actually caring about the people and not my pretty temples that I want built. So get out of here, Israel, and then Rhonda, you can pick up verses 35 and 36.
The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians.
Excellent. And this is, in fact, what God prophesied. Can I get another volunteer, maybe someone in this half of the room where Mark's already, to raise your hand and read another passage? Chris, perfect. All right, Exodus chapter 3. Go back to chapter 3. And Chris will read aloud, and the rest of us will follow along, verses 19 through 22. This is when Moses is encountering the burning bush that isn't being consumed by fire, and God's speaking to him. Go ahead, Chris.
But I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be, when you go, that you shall not go empty-handed.
One more.
But every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians.
All right. So Moses is hearing from God back, way back when. Here's what's going to happen. Pharaoh's going to have a hard heart. I'll massage it at times and seemingly harden it, but it's hard to begin with. Once he relents, y'all are basically going to go to your Egyptian neighbors and say, can you help a guy? And they're going to give you all manner of things. And you're going to essentially plunder the Egyptians, although it's going to be voluntary. You're not going to go and riot and loot their property. You're going to knock on the door and say, we're about to leave. Do you have any earrings or any fine purple linens and whatever? And they're going to give these things to the Israelites. So fast forward to chapter 12, what Rhonda read, and sure enough, that's what happens. Hey, we're about to leave. Do y'all have any, gold and silver? And yes, we do. Take all this stuff. And they wander off. So when it comes to chapter 35, when God's telling Moses to tell the people, bring all these things that you would think would not be in the possession of former slaves, that's where they got it. And recall that some of the gold was used earlier in the book of Exodus. Recall that? Recall all the earrings that, didn't get chiseled by hand, but just got thrown in the fire, and all of a sudden a calf comes out. So says Aaron, which was a fib. So they've already spent, so to speak, a good bit of gold. They've actually ingested that gold because, recall, the punishment was it was ground into powder or poured in the water, and these people were to drink it, a mineral-rich beverage. Nonetheless, come chapter 35, they still have a lot of stuff. And so God asks for all this stuff. And the translation that you read, Leslie, yours said a generous heart in chapter. So we're now back. Let's go back to chapter 35. You can remove your fingers from the other chapters. I want to hear chapter 35, verse 5. I want to hear it in whatever translations we have at already. Again, I don't need you going to your phone and finding obscure ones, but whatever you're looking at. Yours said generous heart, I believe, right? Mine says a heart whose heart is willing. There's a phrase we're looking for. Hopefully you can find that phrase. It's at the end of chapter 5. Are there any translations in this room that speak to that aspect with some different wording besides generous heart or a heart who's willing? If so, just tell me out loud what you got. Edwina.
It says, everyone whose heart so moves him.
All right, whose heart so moves him. Good.
Everyone who is willing.
Everyone who is willing. Interesting. Any others? Does that cover the gamut? All right. So my lesson was kind of written from the whose heart is willing, because that was the translation I have, but I think it communicates equally well as we heard from the others. So what does that phrase mean? Whether it's generous heart, heart is willing, who are willing, heart who is moved, what does that mean? What is the standard? Because this is the standard. Moses says, I want all of you who fit this standard to come and do all the stuff. So what does that standard mean? Again, mine says heart who is willing. Lee.
Give without pressure.
All right, give without pressure. What kind of pressure might be the opposite of a heart that's willing? Just since you brought that up.
A hoarding heart, saving.
Okay. All right, so I think he's, let's carve that out. So you're speaking more to not wanting to give at all. I think his comment was more giving, but sort of feeling like you're forced to give, like there's a pressure motivating the giving rather than a voluntariness. Am I correct in understanding what you're saying?
Correct.
All right.
I'm giving to Wilson's Children's Hospital or to the church for a special offering.
Okay.
It's not, nobody is pressuring, nobody is putting the squeeze on me, if you will.
All right, the squeeze. Yeah, so let's talk about this squeeze. And we're going to get to what you said, because I definitely want to talk about that heart. But let's talk about the heart that's feeling squeezed, to use Lee's good word. What are some of the things that might make a heart feel squeezed to maybe not so voluntarily give? Fear. Interesting.
They might not be sure that it's a good thing to give.
Okay, so maybe there's some doubt about the worthiness of the cause, so to speak. Appearance. Maybe I want to look like a giver, even though my heart's not really so willing, but I got to keep up a reputation or a persona. Good. It'd be like a peer pressure kind of a thing.
Some of these guys call you 5 times a day.
All right. So maybe the unrelenting solicitor person that makes you, okay, if I give, will you shut up?
I'm definitely not giving until you stop calling.
All right. What are some other squeezes that hearts might encounter in the moment of giving or not giving?
Guilt.
Guilt. Interesting. Good.
Your boss.
Say that again?
Your boss.
All right, so it might be, a person of position over you that, a little harder to say no.
How about being a cheerful giver?
Well, and we see that in the New Testament. Paul, I think it was Paul's writings that talk about a cheerful giver. And I think Moses is essentially trying to craft the same standard, just wording it differently. So I wanted to be sure we kind of understood what this idea was, everyone whose heart is willing, and the other variations we heard. So Rhonda's answer was on the opposite, and go ahead, please. Well, we're going to get there. You're asking good questions. That's a good question, and it's right here, Rhonda. But we're not there yet. So as contrasted with all of that, we have the person who just flat doesn't want to give. What are some reasons why someone just flat doesn't want to give? And again, not a right answer, just sort of throw out some thoughts.
They can't afford it?
All right, either they can't afford it or they perceive they can't afford it. What else?
Saving for my retirement.
This money.
You asking me?
I was, yes. As it turns out, I wanted David Hudson's personal answer.
They don't believe in the cause.
All right, yeah, maybe they don't believe in the cause, or maybe they believe in their future more than the cause, and I want to kind of hold on to it because aren't I supposed to be a good steward, and part of that's not leaving myself high and dry or leaving my family with nothing? Other thoughts?
Some of the reasons people may not go to church is they think that the church is just out for the money.
Okay.
Yeah, what's in it for me?
No, that's definitely a prevailing mindset. Good. Lee.
A fraudulent ask. The company has got a bad rep or has been discovered embezzlement, that sort of thing.
Okay. So, I mean, that would be probably a wise choice to not give, a situation like that. So sometimes the not giving is actually the appropriate answer because it's not a worthy cause or it's bogus or whatever else.
Especially if you had given gold for the calf and look what happened.
Yeah. Good. Okay.
Some of the pastors that have embezzled, that are national figures, people
Sure.
look at them and say, well, I'm not going to give, look what happened.
And that contained, all of Christendom because you got one bad apple, pastor going rogue, and the whole church is a sorry lot in the mind of the outsider. All right, let's get to the question that I paused. Why did God, why was there this sort of choice-based scenario? The directive was not every one of you come and give me all your earrings and all the stuff that the Egyptians voluntarily gave you when you knocked on the door and said, we're leaving, can you give us stuff? It was give, whose heart was willing or moved or generous heart, all those things, which means it's an option. Why did God make this moment optional for the Israelites to participate in or not?
Well, think of being a parent and you need your child to do something.
Okay?
Do you want the child to do it begrudgingly? I think not. You want to do it because
Right.
the child loves you, because the child wants to do it, or the child wants to give you something. And I think it's the same thing with God. He wants us to want to because we love him.
Well said, Barbara. Hopefully they might pick that up, because I don't want to paraphrase that. That was really well said, as is. Other thoughts?
Also, God may have different things for different people. He might want this person to do this and this person to do that. Maybe we don't all have to do the same thing.
All right, so maybe the one-size-fits-all directive really wouldn't work, because God intends certain people to have certain roles and others to have other roles, because he's working in their hearts. And if they're receptive to it, some people's hearts will be willing to give a lot of stuff, and some people's hearts might be willing to be the ones putting chisel to minerals and fabricating the things and whatnot. Very good. Peggy?
I was just wondering, were the people aware that there was this group of guys or gals coming to their house maybe to collect gold and...
The Egyptians you're talking about?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'd have a hard time giving up my earrings.
You do this and Peggy's not going to answer the door. Yeah, it doesn't really say it doesn't say what prepared the Israelites or the Egyptians, other than God knew it was coming, and obviously he had an influence in that. How that played out exactly is a good question. But they're here in chapter 35 despite making a golden calf that has since been ground to powder, they still have a lot of stuff, and God needs it. But God doesn't say, every one of you come and do this, thus saith the Lord. It's if you have a willing heart, if your heart is moved, if your heart is generous, come. Which gives people the opportunity to say, I'll do that. My heart is generous, or I don't want to do that because I'm saving for retirement, or I don't like this cause, or whatever other things that we've discussed that can motivate a person to be generous at heart or not. The Israelites had that same opportunity. Yes?
Maybe the Egyptians felt like if they did that, or gave up their personal belongings like that, it would kind of make up for the way they had been treated when they were in Egypt. I don't know. I mean...
So you're back to the Egyptians giving, because they might feel like that's a payment for generations worth of lousy treatment of the Israelites.
Yeah, I would say also, as much then as it is today, if your heart is not desiring to give out of love for God, then don't give. Don't bother.
Because he doesn't need anything of ours. He could take it and get it from some other means. That's a great point, Mark.
And that's the thing, is that as the story goes on, they get too much.
Yeah, would you just stop? I'm going to go there. We're not there yet. You people are running amok with my lesson. I don't understand.
Just take a break.
And I scold the two of you for going where I don't want you to go just yet. Yes, the story ends well, and I do want to give props to the Israelites, who finally seem to do well in some of the narratives where they don't seemingly otherwise. All right, so let's put ourselves, before we get to the end of the story, we're at this moment of the story, chapter 35, and Moses is telling the Israelites, God needs all the stuff. Any one of you who's essentially feeling so inclined, bring it. So imagine you're in that moment. You have now left a land of captivity that you and your descendants have been in for 200 some odd years, and you're going to a land that I think you generally know where you're going, but you don't know the particulars, and you've got stuff, and yes, it's recently acquired. Some of the questions I'm kind of talking through as I'm speaking right now was, was their willingness maybe influenced by the fact that they only got it recently? It wasn't something they've had for a long time. Like it wasn't passed down from generation to generation. This is great Joe, Uncle Joe's whatever, and I'm not going to put it on the pile here and have it burned to make something else. You can think that. You can think that maybe the recency of acquisition might have an impact on how generous or not. But as I thought through that, I thought there's a counterpoint. They don't know what they're going into. And they might really think, wasn't the point of us getting this stuff so that we could be basically equipped for when we occupy our own land, coming empty-handed with just a bunch of oxen and nothing else? Isn't the plunder that we got from the Egyptians in part to prepare us and enable us to be this thriving nation that God surely wants us to be, or he wouldn't have bothered? Those are some thoughts, that an Egyptian or an Israelite person might have as I kind of wrestled through the question. Let me just ask the questions that I'm talking through just to put them out there. Does it matter that the Israelites only recently gained possession of much of this stuff? Does one's willingness now transition away from the Israelites to one, meaning me and you? Does one's willingness to give something depend on its value, on what it took to get, earn, or acquire it, or on what future use it might be put to? I'm kind of wanting to now get into the, we're digging now past the weeds and into the dirt of this issue. What are the things that when we are in this moment of having the potential to have a heart that's willing to give, or a heart that's so inclined, are these some of the issues that we wrestle with? And the reason I'm asking these questions is because I'm giving you an insight into my mind. Those are some of the issues that I wrestle with as I have those moments of giving or not giving. What is the value of this thing? Is it easier to give something of little value? Sure. And that's why the sacrifices, when you go to Leviticus, and you've already gotten a glimpse of it, but when you get to Leviticus 1 through 7, as he goes through the sacrifices, it's the unblemished, it's the firstborn, it's the most valuable of the animal, in the bunch, so to speak. And God wants that, not the scraggly old gnarly thing that isn't worth a darn. He wants the good stuff. He wants the valuable stuff for the reasons that Barbara basically said. But if you're anything like me, that's a factor. As you sit there and think about, this moment of generosity, this is a lot that I'm feeling maybe I should give, but I don't really so much want to because it's a lot. Or I worked hard to get this. Or this was, passed down for many generations. Or wouldn't it be wise to make good use of this now so it provides something valuable in the future? And you can even rationalize, and it can provide more, give me a better chance to give in the future. That's one terrific rationalization we can make, is I want to bank it, so that way I'm more generous in year 20 than I am in year 1, even though perhaps in year 20 you're singing the same song, and there's never a year 20 because you're always chasing year 20 because you never actually get to the point of feeling like, okay, now I can give. Again, insight into your teacher's mindset. Thoughts on some of these issues, thoughts on kind of those things that could percolate in the person's brain as their moment of giving knocks on their door, and do they open or do they keep it closed? And I'm talking too much. Other thoughts, questions from any of the rest of you? It's okay if you don't. But
I'm not saying we should be foolish, but I've never seen anybody who gets diagnosed with cancer actually be able to buy their way out of it or trade their way out of it. I've never seen gold heal any physical problem. I've only seen it deteriorate people's minds and their hearts and cause their family to fight over it. And I'm not saying we should just be pilfered as Christians in our giving for any cause, but I do think we actually have to kind of look at it and say, what am I storing up all this stuff for? Or what am I really after? Because, death is coming, and I'm not supposed to stay here. And how much does this really matter? Does it matter?
Great questions. Great questions. And Jesus had a couple of teachings that kind of touched on both ends of that spectrum. Recall there was one teaching, and I'm going to maybe butcher it a little bit, but to the effect of someone finds himself their crops are particularly fruitful, and they decide, I'm going to build this big silo and store it up. And he basically says, you're going to die tonight. What the heck good is it that you stored up all this stuff? But at the same time, Jesus had a couple of teachings that were about if a general's going against another, he should assess his troops. And if he finds that he's not able, then he should seek peace. And so there's the idea of we need to have some level of stewardship and mindfulness, but not to the extent of hoarding it and having it serve ultimately no purpose. So I think it's hard, personally, I think it's hard sometimes in certain moments to find what's the appropriate fulcrum, on that balance, to use physics. What is it that makes that thing balance? Where do I go on the generosity or stewardship spectrum? Is now the time to give a lot? Is now the time to not give much? Am I finding myself in the whole process? Because there is a place for both, I think, to the point you're making. There's a place to be wise and not foolish with the resources God gave you, but it's not for self-consumption. Patrick.
I think Jesus also said, if you love me, you'll obey my command.
He sure did.
Chapter 35 starts off with what the Lord God commanded Moses to speak in verse 1, and then also right before verse 5, he says it again, this is the thing which the Lord commanded. And I think that heart issue is where your heart is, there your treasure will be also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a sense of obeying out of love, not just obeying. We talk about grudgingly.
Right.
Compulsion.
Yeah.
I mean, he wants the heart. He wants our heart, and he wants it. And then when our hearts, and we've already said this, but when our heart is in tune with the love of God, you desire to obey him, and you give.
Agree.
Your shirt, give him your shirt if you want. You know, it makes it easier to decide.
No.
To give.
Great points. Great points. And I think that's why the standard was the heart, because it's an outflow of the heart. It's an outflow of our relationship with, in this case, the Lord, and other generous moments might be family members or whomever, but the heart is the impetus for giving, and that was clearly stated by Moses when he, as God commanded. He didn't command everybody. He commanded Moses to communicate to the people, all of you whose hearts are willing. Peggy.
Chapter 35 in Exodus, verse 3.
Okay.
Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Now, what does that mean? Don't cook, don't light a candle for, just because we want to.
Yeah. Peggy, I'm gonna just ignore that question because I want to finish up with this one. We'll chat afterwards and kind of some thoughts on that, but I want to wrap up the giving thing. That's a fair question. It speaks of Sabbath, and there's a lot of Sabbath instructions, and actually I had that on the queue last week about how frequently God called the Sabbath and set really strict parameters on what one should do and shouldn't. And your question strikes one particular example. More than I can really chat in 2 seconds and then get back to the lesson. So, all right. Well, thank you. So let's go back to now. I want to get to what the people do. I want to let Rhonda kind of let the cat out of the bag. I told her to tighten it up yet. Yeah. So again, this is the directive, and we talked through what that means, and we talked through the issues that the people would face, and we talked through the issues that we face when God gives us the opportunity to demonstrate a willing and generous heart. And hopefully in having that talking session, we've maybe seen some attributes of our own rationalization or otherwise, and hopefully gotten some inspiration from the Word and from our communications to be mindful of that and to cultivate a willing heart and not a self-secured heart and the other things that might tempt us to do opposite. But now let's see, what did the people do? The people were given this charge, this opportunity. What did they do? So let's go to chapter 35, beginning verse 20. Can I get Mark to walk around because I got a few volunteers. Can I get someone to read verses 20 through 24? Show me by hand who you are so our mic can come to you. I need a hand in the air. Come on now. All right, Isaac, great. I was waiting for you, man. Couldn't hold that on me. All right, chapter 35, verse 20 through 24. Go ahead, sir.
And all the congregation of the children of Israel departed from the presence of Moses. Then everyone came whose heart was stirred, and everyone whose spirit was willing, and they brought the Lord's offering for the work of the tabernacle of meeting, for all its service, and for the holy garments. They came, both men and women, as many as had a willing heart, and brought earrings and nose rings and necklaces, all jewelry of gold, that is, every man who made an offering of gold to the Lord. And every man with whom was found blue, purple, and scarlet thread, fine linen and goat's hair, red skins of rams and badger skins, brought them. Everyone who offered an offering of silver or bronze brought the Lord's offering, and everyone with whom was found acacia wood for any work of the service brought it.
Good deal. All right, next reader, volunteer, similar kind of a long passage, sorry. Chapter 36, verses 2 through 7. Yeah, a voluntold reader, Cody Lauterbaugh, thank you for volunteering. Chapter 36, next chapter, verses 2 through 7.
All right. And Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab.
Good job.
And every craftsman in whose mind the Lord had put skill, everyone whose heart stirred him up to come to do the work. And they received from Moses all the contribution of the people of Israel had brought, for doing the work on the sanctuary. They still kept bringing him freewill offerings every morning, so that all the craftsmen who were doing every sort of task on the sanctuary came, each from the task that he was doing, and said to Moses, "The people bring much more than enough for doing the work that the Lord has commanded us to do." So Moses gave command, and word was proclaimed throughout the camp, "Let no man or woman do anything more for the contribution for the sanctuary." So the people were restrained from bringing, for the material they had was sufficient to do all the work and more.
Excellent. Thank you, Cody. And I'll read the last. So chapter 38 gives us a little specificity into this generous giving by the people. I'm going to reading verses 24 through 29, Exodus chapter 38. All the gold of the presentation offering that was used for the project and all the work on the sanctuary was 2,193 pounds. Again, your translation might have a different weight unit than pounds. According to the sanctuary shekel, the silver from the community who were registered was 7,544 pounds, according to the sanctuary shekel. Skip down to 27, there were 7,500 pounds of silver used to cast the bases of the sanctuary and the bases of the veil, 100 bases from 7,500 pounds, 75 pounds for each base, with the remaining 44 pounds made hooks, blah, blah, blah. 29, the bronze of the presentation offering totaled 5,310 pounds. So I'll just stop right there. So we just have some specific quantities, but to the point that was raised earlier, in this moment, Israel responded really well. I've been quick to point out the failings of the Israelites, and I hope I've been quick to let us realize that we failed much the same as they do, and they don't look really much different than we do. Hopefully that's the same for this moment, because in this moment, the Israelites were given the opportunity to have willing hearts, to have generous hearts, to be so moved, and the other translations that we had, and in fact they were. They gave so much that the craftsmen who were in charge looked and said, "We got enough. In fact, we have more than enough. Make them stop." And Moses made them stop. I pray that we would be willing-hearted like the Israelites, and God's opportunities to challenge us to give for the worthy causes that he lays out before us. Let me close this in prayer. God, we do thank you for not mandating gift giving, but giving us the opportunities to have hearts that are desiring to please you. As you did with the Israelites, same with us, you give us the means to give. And even though we might look at our situations and feel that we do not have adequate means, this example tells us differently. And I pray that we would trust in the means you give us, that we would trust in the opportunities to give when you are directing, that our hearts would be willing, not squeezed, that we might demonstrate in this moment behavior similar to the Israelites, that our worship pleases you. You are worthy of whatever you ask us to give. May we do so freely, voluntarily, and out of a love for you. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thank you.